There's a kind of pain that doesn't scream. It just sits there, quiet, heavy, confusing. It's the pain of being left by someone who once looked at you like you mattered, and then suddenly became cold, distant, unreachable. No real explanation, no visible grief, no dramatic collapse, just silence, just absence. Just that unbearable feeling that while you were breaking open, they were somehow able to walk away untouched. And that is the part that haunts you. Not just that they left, but how calm they seemed, how quickly they disappeared into themselves, how they could go from intimate to indifferent with almost surgical precision, as if the bond meant everything to you and almost nothing to them. So you replay it. Every message, every shift in tone, every delayed reply. Every time they pulled away and called it stress, pressure, needing space. You wonder if they ever loved you at all. You wonder if you imagined the whole thing. You wonder how someone can hold your face with tenderness one day and then act like your pain is an inconvenience the next. But the dark truth about avoidance after a breakup is this. The moment you start chasing closure, you start feeding the very mechanism that made them leave. That's the brutal truth no one wants to say out loud. Because your instinct is understandable. You want answers. You want one honest conversation. You want them to finally see what they did. You want your pain to land somewhere. But when you pursue an avoidant from a place of emotional hunger, they don't suddenly become clearer, softer, more available. They feel flooded, cornered, trapped by emotional intensity they do not know how to metabolize. And the more real your pain becomes, the more they run from it. Not because they don't care. Because they care in a nervous system that equates closeness with danger. That's what makes this so devastating. You were trying to connect. They were trying to survive. Avoidant attachment is not just coldness. It is not simply pride. It is not some cartoon villain energy where they sit back and enjoy hurting people. It's far darker than that, and far sadder. It is a deeply conditioned relationship with vulnerability where dependence feels unsafe, emotional needs feel exposing, and intimacy itself can activate threat. When an avoidant starts falling deeply for someone, the conscious mind may call it love, but the nervous system often calls it risk. And the body always votes first. This is why breakups with avoidance are so psychologically disorienting. On the surface, it looks like they detached because they stopped caring. But underneath, what often happens is more complicated. The system becomes overwhelmed by emotional closeness, unresolved expectations, fear of engulfment, fear of failure, fear of losing control. The bond gets too important. The feelings get too intense. The relationship starts asking for the one thing they were never taught how to give safely: sustained emotional presence. So their brain does what it learned to do a long time ago: create distance, suppress longing, minimize attachment, numb the body, rationalize the withdrawal, and then they call it clarity. But it isn't always clarity. Sometimes it's deactivation. That's the word people rarely understand. Deactivation is what happens when the avoidant mind starts shutting down emotional access in order to reduce internal stress. The warmth cools. The longing gets buried. Flaws become magnified. Your needs feel too much. The relationship starts feeling like pressure instead of connection. Even beautiful moments can begin to feel heavy, simply because intimacy is asking their nervous system to stay open longer than it knows how. This is not poetry, it's biology. When closeness triggers threat, the amygdala lights up. Stress hormones like cortisol rise. The body stops experiencing love as pure pleasure and starts experiencing it as emotional exposure. The dopamine that once came from pursuit and mystery begins to drop when the bond becomes stable, predictable, and real. What should feel safe begins to feel suffocating, not because you became unlovable, but because their nervous system confuses consistency with the loss of freedom. So after the breakup, while you are drowning in emotional presence, they often enter a strange state of emotional anesthesia, and that's why their silence feels almost inhuman. But silence is the core concept you need to understand here. Silence is not always emptiness. With avoidance, silence is often regulation. It is how they reduce stimulation. It is how they regain a sense of self. It is how they avoid feeling the full weight of what the relationship meant. They go quiet not only to escape you, but to escape what awakens inside them when they think of you too closely. That's why they can seem relieved after the breakup. Relief is real, but relief is not the same thing as indifference. Relief simply means the pressure has stopped. The texts have stopped. The emotional mirrors have stopped. The need to explain themselves has stopped. The possibility of disappointing someone has stopped. And for a while, that feels like peace. But then, something darker begins. Because once the emotional noise fades, so does the defensive adrenaline that was helping them stay numb. And in the quiet, what they buried starts moving. This is the part most people never see. At first, an avoidant after a breakup may look almost disturbingly fine. They may become more social, more productive, more casual. They may post as if life is moving on effortlessly. They may even appear lighter. And this can destroy you if you don't understand what you're looking at. You're not seeing freedom. You're seeing decompression. You're seeing a nervous system that just escaped emotional intensity and is trying to convince itself it made the right choice. So they stay busy. They distract. They intellectualize. They reduce the relationship to a few manageable conclusions. It wasn't right. It became too much. They needed space. It would never have worked. You were too emotional. They were too overwhelmed. The timing was wrong. But when the body calms and the distance becomes real, memory changes. And memory is cruel. Because now they don't just remember the pressure. They remember your softness, your patience, your laugh, the safety of your presence, the way you understood things they never had to explain, the way you saw through them without humiliating them, the way you loved them without demanding that they become someone else overnight. And that's when silence shifts. It stops being relief. It starts becoming an echo. They hear songs differently. They look at their phone differently. They reread old messages they told themselves didn't matter. They visit your social media without touching anything. They imagine reaching out and then feel a jolt of resistance. They miss you, but the missing doesn't turn them into poets. It turns them into ghosts. That's the dark truth. Avoidants often grieve in reverse, not because they're evil, because they delay feeling until it's safe enough to feel. While you bleed immediately, they often freeze first and feel later, sometimes much later. Sometimes when you've already begun rebuilding. Sometimes when they sense you're no longer emotionally available to them. Sometimes when your silence becomes louder than their distance ever was. Because here's what really unsettles an avoidant. Not your pain, but your emotional independence. When you keep reaching, you remain psychologically accessible. They may feel pressure, guilt, irritation, even tenderness, but they do not feel loss in full. You are still there, still orbiting, still proving the bond exists, still carrying the emotional weight for both of you. But when you go still, truly still, something changes. Not performative silence, not silence as manipulation, not silence while secretly waiting at the window for a notification. Real silence. The kind born from self-respect. The kind that says, I will not keep offering my nervous system to someone who only knows how to touch it when they're lonely. That silence lands differently. Because now they can't regulate through your availability. Now they can't assume access. Now the story in their head begins to break. And this is where the power dynamic flips. Not because you played a game better, because you stepped out of the game entirely. Imagine what happens inside them then. They wake up and notice you're no longer watching. No long emotional paragraphs, no breadcrumbs from you, no attempts to decode them, no visible ache, no proof that they still occupy your inner world. And suddenly the distance they once controlled becomes distance they can't measure. That uncertainty gets under the skin. Now the same nervous system that once felt smothered by closeness can become activated by absence. Dopamine starts attaching to what is no longer predictable. The mystery returns, but this time it surrounds you. Their mind starts filling in blanks. Are you healing? Have you changed? Are you moving on? Did they lose someone who actually saw them? Did they confuse safety with boredom? Did they call love pressure because they were terrified of being known? And what you need to understand is that obsession often begins where access ends. This is why some avoidants come back in ways that feel almost surreal. Not always with vulnerability, not always with apology. Sometimes it's subtle. A random message, a reaction to a story, a strangely timed check-in, a memory sent without context. They don't always return with language for what happened. Sometimes they just circle the door they once slammed shut, hoping it opens without requiring them to explain why they left. Because explanation would mean contact with shame. And shame is the hidden engine here. Avoidants don't just fear being overwhelmed by others. They fear what intimacy exposes in them, their needs, their limitations, their dependency, their emotional inconsistency, their inability to stay present when love becomes real. So when they hurt someone they care about, it doesn't always produce clean remorse. It often produces more avoidance, more hiding, more silence. Because shame says, if I go back now, I'll have to face what I did. So they miss you and resist you at the same time. They long and withdraw at the same time. They remember and repress at the same time. This is why loving an avoidant can feel like being adored by someone who disappears every time the love starts becoming visible. But this is where I need to say something difficult. You cannot build your self-worth around being the one they finally come back for. That fantasy will poison you. Because if your healing becomes a strategy to awaken their pursuit, then you are still emotionally organized around their nervous system instead of your own. You are still making them the center. You are still saying, in a quieter voice, please validate what I meant. No. The real shift happens when their return stops being the prize. The real shift happens when you understand that being deeply affected by someone does not mean you were meant to shrink around their limitations. It does not mean your tenderness was too much. It does not mean your need for clarity was unreasonable. It means you collided with someone whose survival pattern could not hold the depth of what was being asked of them. That is tragic. But it is not your failure. And this is the warning almost nobody gives. If they do come back before doing the deeper work, the pattern will return in a new outfit. Maybe softer, maybe slower, maybe more self-aware in language. But without nervous system repair, self-confrontation, and a real capacity for emotional endurance, the cycle repeats. The closeness builds, the fear rises, the deactivation returns. And once again, you are left trying to understand how someone can kiss you with longing and still leave like they were escaping fire. So do not confuse reappearance with transformation. Read that again in your bones. Do not confuse reappearance with transformation. Someone missing you is not the same as someone being able to love you safely. Someone regretting the breakup is not the same as someone being capable of staying. Someone feeling your absence is not the same as someone having healed their relationship with intimacy. And that is why your power was never supposed to come from making them obsess. It was supposed to come from becoming unreachable to what breaks you. That is real power. The moment you stop auditioning for emotional security, you begin to recover your own. The moment you stop interpreting their withdrawal as proof of your inadequacy, your body starts unclenching from a story that was never yours to carry. The moment you realize their silence was often panic wearing the mask of indifference, you stop begging cold behavior to become warm enough to heal you. You begin to see clearly. You were not hard to love. They were not ready to remain open. You were not asking for too much. They were activated by what real closeness requires. You were not abandoned because you lacked value. You were left by someone who mistook disconnection for control. And once you understand that, something sacred happens. You stop craving the text. You stop worshipping the almost. You stop confusing emotional unavailability with depth. You stop calling anxiety chemistry. You stop calling confusion love. You become dangerous to the pattern. Because now, when someone goes cold, you don't chase warmth out of them like it's hidden treasure. You notice. You feel. You honor your grief. But you do not collapse into pursuit. You do not over-explain your value. You do not turn your pain into a bridge for someone who refuses to walk halfway. You stay with yourself. And that changes everything. Because the person you are becoming cannot be sustained by intermittent affection. They cannot live on mixed signals and memory scraps. They cannot keep sacrificing their nervous system just to keep a connection alive. They cannot keep translating silence into hope. They know better now. They know that love is not supposed to feel like waiting outside a locked emotional door, listening for movement inside. They know that intimacy is not supposed to require self-erasure. They know that being chosen inconsistently is still not being chosen. And maybe that is the final dark truth about avoidance after a breakup. Sometimes the breakup reveals more than the relationship ever did. It reveals who carried the emotional depth, who kept reaching, who was willing to feel, who stayed open, who kept turning toward connection even when it hurt. And if that was you, then yes, you suffered more visibly. But visible suffering is not weakness. It is evidence that your heart did not abandon itself to survive. That matters. So if they miss you now, let them miss you. If they wonder about you now, let them wonder. If your silence unsettles them, let it. Not because you need revenge, because you are finally no longer available for half love disguised as complexity. You are no longer trying to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding their own heart. You are no longer waiting for closure from the very person who created the wound. You are no longer measuring your worth by whether an avoidant finally learns how to stay. You are becoming something they can feel, but no longer control. Whole, grounded, untouchable in the places that once begged, soft but not self-betraying, open but not easily consumed, loving but no longer willing to prove that love by suffering. And that is when the story changes. Because the deepest power is not that they come back. It's that by the time they finally feel the loss, you are no longer lost in it. By the time their silence turns into longing, your silence has turned into peace. By the time they begin to understand your value, you are no longer asking them to name it. You already know. You were never too much. You were simply given to someone who had learned to experience depth as danger. Now you know the difference. And once you know the difference, you stop running after people who only love you best at a distance. You choose what chooses you, clearly. You choose what stays. You choose what can hold your heart without trembling at its weight. Most of all, you choose yourself. Not the wounded self that keeps hoping abandonment will reverse itself. Not the starving self that mistakes attention for devotion. Not the frightened self that wants one more message, one more sign, one more explanation. The real self. The one beneath the panic. The one beneath the waiting. The one beneath the story that being left made you less. That self is rising now. And when it fully stands, no avoidant, no silence, no breakup, no unanswered question will ever again have the power to define you.